The number one reason people are scared to leave relationships is because they have formed their identity around this individual and they have no idea who they are without it.
You were in the relationship. You kind of had all the things going. You were never less happy in your life.
This life that I had wasn't really mine. Most of it didn't even make me happy, made other people happy. I remember just being so sucked into that life, kind of day in, day out, not really reflecting on anything. I felt almost guilt and shame because I was like, nothing's wrong. There's people that have such, objectively worse lives, and I am here, and it's like my relationship isn't the worst. I really felt ungrateful, and that was the hardest hurdle for me. It's like, well, it's not that bad. I don't think that's worth living for. Not that bad is not my definition of fulfillment anymore.
I would wake up to go pee at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and my first thought was, I hate my life. And then my second thought was, you're so bad. How can you think that? It's just pouring shame on top of that.
I would rather be rejected for asking what I want than be loved by someone who doesn't know me.
Mic drop. All right, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. There's a lot that I want to talk to you about, but I think the best place to start is with this concept of self-loss, which is something that you explored in your last book. And I heard you on another show talking about your own experience in your life where you were in grad school, you were in the relationship, you kind of had all the things going, and you were never less happy in your life. And that really resonated with me because I've been in that place too. So why don't we start there?
People talk about midlife crisis. I feel like I felt it in my 20s. And yeah, I was in grad school and I was very happy theoretically that I got in, or I thought I was happy that I got in. I got married very young and I was like, oh, this girl, she found the one so early on. The plebs don't know. I'm living that sweet life. I was involved with the community. I felt like I was always praised for what I did and what I look like and all these things. And then I remember just being so sucked into that life, kind of day in, day out, not really reflecting on anything. And then I took a little vacation with my sister and we went to LA, and it kind of just paused my life for a second and allowed me to exist in a different context. And I remember, being like, oh, this feels weird. This feels weird. I wasn't really self-reflective or self-aware. I was like, this just feels different. And then the night before flying back home, I met up with a friend and we were at a whiskey bar, and he was like, Sarah, I know you're doing all these things, but are you happy? And I think my first thought was how dare you? What do you mean?
Straight to being defensive.
Yeah. But then I didn't respond to him, and I just started weeping in the restaurant. Now, for reference, I think I'm really in touch with my emotions now. I was certainly not back then, and I did not cry in public. That was my biggest fear. And I just remember weeping uncontrollably, and he just sat there and was like, what is happening right now? I asked, you're are you happy? It was such a casual question. And that's essentially that very moment is the moment I realized that this life that I had wasn't really mine. It wasn't really consciously mine. There was nothing deliberate, nothing intentional. Most of it didn't even make me happy, made other people happy. And so he kind of broke through the denial through the most simple question imaginable.
Yeah, I could relate to a lot of that. And as I was telling you before we started recording, I kind of had that moment, I would say last year, but there were a lot of things leading up to that moment last year where I had a similar experience. I'd been married for 5 years, but we had been separated a couple years before. Obviously, I was having issues in that area and tried to get back together. And, I just had this moment where I was presented with this health crisis. And suddenly, that was what it took for me to have that moment of kind of awakening. That was my moment in the bar, where I was confronted with oh my God. And I just remember thinking, if I ever get better, because I didn't know what was wrong with me and nobody knew, and it was so debilitating. I was like, if I ever get better, I'm going to change my life because I'm so miserable. And I think that I could look back on the years leading up to that and I was like, wow, I've been living in this turmoil kind of subconsciously because I had this inner life of what I kind of thought that I wanted and desired, and then it wasn't reflected in my outer life. And I feel like that tension manifests in so many different ways. And I was like, wait, I've been having all of these like issues, and I think it did manifest in physical ways and all of that. So I'm curious for you, like what changed after that moment?
Nothing.
Oh,
So,
great.
Let's be really honest. So what happened was I went to the bathroom, had this moment of like looking in a mirror and being like, I don't know who this girl is. Actually, I kind of think I hate her. I don't know who she is, but I think I hate her. She's the reason I'm so freaking miserable all the time. And then I touched up my makeup, walked out of the bathroom and was like, sweet, cute, I did it. Wow. What a powerful experience. And the most embarrassing kind of part was I started grad school. So I was learning how to be a therapist. And the fact that I was like, wow, what a doozy. That was really like transformational and just did nothing. So I saw my friend, went to my hotel room, ordered some burritos and watched Friends. And I would have changed absolutely nothing if it wasn't for the next day when I was flying back home, I got my first panic attack. So when you talk about the physiological sort of catching up, that's exactly what it took for me to kind of stop because I wouldn't have. I would have just been like, no, I can do this. I was very stubborn. I thought that was the right thing to do. I didn't think what I wanted really mattered, and I would have kept going. And the fact that I thought I was dying quite literally from this panic attack, I had the same moment where I was like, if I survive, I will burn my entire life to the ground. Like it was like this promise to myself because I was like, I'm dying and I've never even lived. Like, how tragic. This is so sad. And so I had that first panic attack, and it was so severe that I went into like partial paralysis. I couldn't move my arms, I couldn't speak, I couldn't move my legs. And so it was really scary. I genuinely thought that was the end. And after, I got home, I started getting panic attacks very frequently, kind of like a nice reminder that whenever I wanted to not do something, it was like, hey, hey. And so I did. I essentially burned my life to the ground.
Wow.
Yeah.
I heard you say that something along the lines of, we hate the truth and it's there regardless of how much we try to hide from it. And I think that
I'm
that's
really
kind
motivational.
But I mean, I think so many of us have that experience. And, when I look back on my own experience, I can see that like the truth was there, but I was trying every which way to avoid it. And at some point, you're going to be faced with it, right? Whether it's the panic attack on the flight or the health issue or whatever the situation is. And unfortunately, I think fear is the great motivator, right? And so for a lot of people, it takes hitting that bottom, whatever it is, to make a change. So after you burned your life to the ground,
Yeah.
How did you start finding yourself?
I mean, it took such a long time. And it wasn't about, I think I had to reword that in my own mind. It wasn't about finding, it was about creating. Because when I think about finding myself, it means it exists externally, which was my problem in the first place because I was trying to find it externally. And then also my tendency would have been to go back, to be like, well, pre-marriage, pre-grad, like trying to find those versions and find myself. And so it was kind of like, what if it never truly existed? And what if I just get to create who I become? And so what I did was try a lot of things. Within reason, try everything. But it was like, am I the type of person that enjoys living here? Honestly, asking myself that question. Am I the type of person that is enjoying this program that I'm enrolled in? Am I the type of person that wants a marriage moving forward? Do I believe in marriage or not? And so it was just asking myself the most basic questions. And one of the examples I have in the book is the Julia Roberts movie, Runaway Bride. I don't know if you've seen it. And I love it because it was just such a perfect embodiment of what so many people go through, where you like pretend to like the eggs, the type of eggs that the other person likes. And you never really sit there to be like, do I like scrambled eggs? Do I like poached eggs? Like, I'm just going to eat whatever they offer me just to be low maintenance or just to like I don't know, bond over the eggs, whatever it is. And so I love that scene in the movie where she finally sits down, makes like dozens of eggs and spends time with herself just to taste them and try them, be like, what do I actually want? And so that is what I tried to do, was mindfully tasting, trying, failing, and then being like, who do I want to be? And would that person do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I feel like so many of us outsource all of these things to other people, and it kind of accumulates throughout our lives to the point where we get to this place. And I know that this is resonating with so many people, because when I did get divorced and I started talking about just that turmoil and the difficulty of being in a relationship that wasn't quote unquote bad, but it wasn't the right relationship.
That's the hardest sometimes.
And how and why and when and how to make the decision to leave and the fear and all of that. And the response was overwhelming, because I think so many people are finding themselves in this place where they have been outsourcing their whole lives. They have been focusing more on their relationship with others than their relationship with their self, which I know you talk about. And then they get to this place where they're like, I'm miserable, but I also don't know how to change.
Or I'm miserable, and I felt almost guilt and shame, because I was like, nothing's wrong. There's people that have such, objectively worse lives, and I am here, and it's like my relationship isn't the worst. You know what I mean? And it's like my whatever, the city I'm living in isn't the worst. Like I felt so much guilt, especially with my background of like living through wars as a child and seeing realities that were just so painful and wounding and unpleasant. And so for me to complain in my 20s about a seemingly nice life, I really felt ungrateful. And that was the hardest hurdle for me. It's like, well, it's not that bad. And I don't think that's worth living for. Not that bad is not my definition of fulfillment anymore. But being like, I actually deserve more, or I'm allowed to want more, that was the hardest part of like starting this process of change and evolution.
Yeah, I could not agree with that more. Not to just keep like
no, I
going
love
back
that.
to
we were both like, yes.
I mean, the shame, yeah,
The shame
was so powerful. And I felt that way too. And especially, I don't know the circumstances of your situation, but for me, like I had this crazy lifestyle too, because of like who I was married to and like things that I had achieved in my career and all of that. And I was like, how ungrateful of me to be so miserable. And I've talked about this on the podcast. I would wake up to like go pee at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And my first thought was, I hate my life. And then my second thought was, you're so bad. How can you think that? It's just pouring shame on top of that very real truth. It's like when you're waking up in the middle of the night.
And that's your first
I know
thought.
like there's some neuroscience to it about like why your amygdala or something. I don't know. Not even going to attempt that one. But that was like, I felt it in my bones, because I wasn't distracted with so many other things like I was during the day. And I felt so much shame. And so for so long, I just buried it. And I don't know if that was your experience at all too.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of guilt as well for me. It was like, well, maybe I am not trying hard enough to enjoy this. Like maybe I should be really grateful for the fact that like I was just treated this way. I think it placed a lot of responsibility on me. And although I'm very pro responsibility, I think I was taking the wrong type of responsibility at that time in my life. And so I felt a lot of guilt for not being able to make it work and for letting people down, because I wasn't the best partner when I was that miserable and didn't want to be in that relationship. And I don't think when I look back to that version of me, it just wasn't me. And so there was a lot of guilt that like I was letting people down, and that my decision even to get divorced was going to let a lot of people down. And so there was just so much guilt of like, I'm so selfish. I'm willing to hurt so many people just to be happy. Like, how gross, Sarah. Really? Truly, that's what you're going to do? And I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have the panic attacks. I'm almost like, I think I would have pushed for another decade and then snapped.
Same.
I would have been like, I'm that stubborn. I would have pushed a decade or two and then snapped. And I'm so glad that the panic attacks don't let me do that. But yeah, I felt a lot of guilt for not being able to make it work and for letting people down.
Yeah, I can relate on so many levels. And I feel like there are kind of two camps, especially in the advice that we hear nowadays, this advice era, especially on social media, where it's like, nobody's perfect, find ways to make it work. Like, nobody's going to fulfill all of your needs. Like, don't outsource all of your happiness. It needs to come from within. And then there are the people who are like more on that, maybe like quote unquote selfish end of the spectrum, where it's like, no, you only have like this one life. Do what makes you happy. Where do you think you fall on that spectrum?
I'm probably smack in the middle where I do think that we need to seize the day, so to speak. I do think that life is a little absurd and I'm an existentialist. I have to. Like, it's just like, I think we need to take more responsibility for the way we live, but we also just need to not take it so seriously. It kind of hand in hand. And so I'm definitely sort of in the camp of if you're so miserable, take what for is really my like what for? What is the award you think you're going to receive as a consequence? But I do think that being too selfish is irresponsible, even for yourself. And so I do think having realistic expectations of your partner is really important, and being realistic about what kind of partner you are and what you're contributing to that dynamic is key. So it's kind of like both. That was such a non-exciting answer. It's like
No, but I appreciate that because, I feel like we're just in this era where the sexier it is, like, or the louder it is, then that's what makes its way to the top as far as like content, advice, all of that. When it comes to dating, when it comes to wellness, when it comes to nutrition. I had somebody on yesterday where we were talking about nutrition, and she's a dietitian, and she's like, I mean, it's like kind of moderation and like, do
so not
this, like,
sexy.
yeah, the least sexy. And she got it. She's like, I know people want to hear like exactly what to do. And, these extremes are what people latch onto, I think. But I feel like as far as dating and relationships go, it does seem like we're in this really confusing time because people are finding themselves in relationships that maybe they don't feel aligned with. And then alternatively, they're so scared of leaving those relationships, even if they're not fulfilled, because of how terrible dating culture is made out to be.
And we've also made single like a dirty word, which I have no idea why. I know so many happy single people, like consciously, like deliberately single people. And I have no idea why there's such fear around it. I think a lot of it is because we deprioritize friendships and colleagues and family. And so all this love that we're trying to achieve, we're trying to get it from one source. But I think the number one reason people are scared to leave relationships is because they have formed their identity around this individual and they have no idea who they are without it. And so it's not so much that they're going to miss the person, which sure, it's this existential dread of having to figure out who the hell you are post this relationship. I think that tends to be the biggest hurdle for individuals. It just feels so overwhelming and you've invested so much that you're like, nah, I'm good. I'm just going to sit here.
Do you have any tips for any listeners who are finding themselves kind of in that place where they're like, okay, I know it's the right thing to do to leave. How do they find the courage and how do they embark on that journey, for lack of a better word, of like figuring out who they are and not being so terrified of that prospect?
Yeah. The courage piece is difficult. I love to be like, would you want your daughter to stay? Would you want your best friend to stay? When you're 80, will you be happy you stayed? I think just zooming out and seeing that, gaining that perspective is really powerful in terms of, yeah, this breakup is going to suck in 5 years, but when you're 80, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that thing that happened like 30 years ago, 50 years ago, like you're not going to care. And I think sort of taking away the fear and how big it seems in the moment is really important. And then when you're talking about like how do I kind of build my sense of self or believe that I can outside of this relationship, I think it's like the small steps. Again, people want like really sexy big answers, but it's like go olive tasting. go cheese tasting. Just buy yourself in your journal. Like, and just like be like, what did I enjoy? What did I like? Did I like spending time with myself? What was trigger? What wasn't? Which of the cheeses was my favorite, And or even in the relationship, some people are like, well, I don't know if the relationship is the problem that I don't know myself, or if I'm the problem that kind of then walked into the relationship and now I don't know who I am and it really has nothing to do with the other person, is like scheduling. It's like, okay, so how about you say 3 nights a week we're going to spend time together. And then 2 nights I'm going to spend time with my girlfriends or my friends or my family. And then 2 nights I'm going to spend by myself. And so start expanding beyond the relationship and see how that feels. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a threat to the relationship, because maybe you're sitting there being like, I don't know if they're preventing me from knowing myself or if I just don't know how to know myself and I'm blaming them for it. I don't know if this relationship is wrong for me or if I'm just so lost that it feels wrong for me. And so that way I'm like, expand, explore, spend time that's very intentional in and out of the relationship, get to know yourself a little more in different contexts, and then that can kind of help you evaluate if that's the right thing. And if you're feeling like you do want to leave after that, then great, you're going to get a stronger sense of who you are and have that support system.
And if your partner doesn't like it,
that is a great sign.
Yeah.
that you guys
Pack
need
your
to
bags.
talk about. Yeah, boundaries, expectations. Yeah.
I don't know if you had this experience, but going back to the fear component, I felt like I was standing on the precipice for so long and fearing what was on the other side for so long. And that kind of anticipatory anxiety was so much worse than finally taking the action itself. And I remember I was talking to a friend of mine back when I was kind of like in this, like in between these two places, like knowing I was going to get divorced, but kind of like still thinking maybe there's a way to like salvage this. And my friend was like, you're kind of standing at the edge of the cliff and looking down like this whole time. And I was like, yeah, that's actually exactly how this feels. And not to say that like jumping off that cliff is a negative thing. It was just like being there at like the edge of a decision can often feel so much more terrifying than making the decision itself. And I'm in recovery. So like a big piece of that is action. And I always know that like action is better than stagnation. And once you take an action, at least in my experience, then things start flowing more. Do you have any advice around that?
You know the phrase, what you're not changing, you're choosing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that one hits.
Yeah. So what happens is that when we're standing at that precipice on that cliff, we think we haven't made a choice and we're waiting to make that decision. And what I often say is indecision is decision, right? You're not changing, you're choosing. So you're actually already being an active participant in your reality. We think we're like in this in-between, in this limbo, and now we're waiting to make a choice. And I always go, no, you are consciously right now making a choice. Might not be one that you hope to be making, but I think that puts it in perspective because it's so scary to be in that in-between. And the second I take away the in-between, I'm saying there is no in-between. You're actually making a choice one way or another. I actually think it makes it a little less scary. So that's what I had to do to myself, where I was like, I'm not here being like, will I, won't I? It's like, I'm currently in it. So I'm saying I will. And the day my actions say I won't, that means I've made a different choice. And so I think you're right. The anticipation is so terrible. And so I try to take that away from people. And that helps them often be a bit more proactive.
I'm just nodding and like smiling and laughing because I'm like, I wish somebody had put it to me that way, because I feel like at the time I had so many people validating like, yes, you are in limbo. And I was like, yeah, I am kind of like in this in-between place. But I love that. Like you are making that choice. And that's not to blame or shame, back to what we were saying, but it's just like you're either in or you're out. And even if you're in limbo, you're in.
You're in, and be gracious with yourself. And you might be so frustrated that you're still in. And I often, whenever I'm frustrated by my own actions, which does happen, believe it or not, I ask myself, what am I getting out of this? Because humans are quite clever. We rarely do things that don't benefit us. And so even if I'm looking at my action and I go, I have no idea how on earth this is benefiting me. And yet I'm choosing it over and over and over again. Then I have to sort of park my judgment and be genuinely open and curious to what the answer is of like, what am I getting out of this? And sometimes what I'm getting out of this is time to build courage. Sometimes what I'm getting out of this is like a need that I didn't even realize I needed to be met, And so just being really curious with ourselves and understanding just because we know what to do doesn't mean we'll do it. And that it takes courage to make that next step.
Yeah, and I think so many of us know what to do and know things that are helpful to us and still resist doing those things again until there's like a level of pain or fear that's intolerable, and then we're motivated to do them. Like that's how I am. I always I'm such a rock bottom person. I say this all the time. I had to be like on the brink of death before I got sober. I've had so many rock bottoms, emotional, physical, throughout the past 10 and a half years, where those were the times that I was like, okay, now I'll do something different. Now I'll change.
If it makes you feel better, I think that's humanity. I mean, I think we, at the bare minimum, need tension in order to change. I don't know a single human being that woke up content, fulfilled, and was like, let me change things about myself. Like, that doesn't happen. And I just think people are not super honest about it. So when people ask me like, what made you change? I always emphasize like, it wasn't because I was really enlightened. It wasn't because I was super self-aware. It was because I was in pain. And I think that's just a reality for a lot of people. And I do hope that, the more books are out there, the more conversations, the more podcasts such as yours are out there, people will start to pick up on signs a lot sooner so they can change when there's tension, turmoil, discomfort, rather than like pain, suffering, despair.
I loved what you said before about being single and not fearing being single. If people feel like they want to be dating, what are some common pitfalls, do you think, in today's dating society?
Oh my God, where do we start? Well, first of all, we treat each other like we go human shopping. Like, you know what I mean? Like we treat each other like it's an Uber delivery. And so we're like, well, I ordered this. And then when they show up on a date, I hear this all the time. It's like they weren't exactly what I expected. It's like, dude, this is not like an Amazon like same day delivery. Like there's no guarantees. Like we have really dehumanized each other to the point where I hear people be like, oh, they were great, but like their sweater was really scratchy and like the way they laughed was really, and it was just like, dude.
Yeah.
I think the reason we can speak about people like that is because there is an element of dehumanization and level of like shopping for your date. But I think it's just inherently unhealthy. Like this is a human being with like feelings, experiences, depth for some. And so I think that's one of like our attitude towards it is quite warped. And I think that's not helping. The second thing is it's become so performative. And I think people are just showing up the way that they think the other person wants them to show up. And then they might get the attraction and connection, and then slowly they will start to reveal who they really are. And then there's going to be tension, then there's going to be confusion for both parts. And I think it's why we have such messy breakups and situationships also. I'm not a huge fan. I think healthy relationships are founded on clear boundaries and communication. And I don't think situationships operate that way. And I'm not saying you have to be like committed or fit into any one sort of relationship dynamic. But I do think that you need to discuss like, what does it mean for you? It can be unique, but what does it mean for you? And what are the parameters around that? And so I think a lot of us are struggling with self-esteem, so we don't want to push people away. We don't want to be too high maintenance, so boundaries are out the window. And so what's happening is we're all, what I'm noticing is people are so desperate to be loved, which makes sense. We all want that they're not really doing anything that might make someone not like them, but that anything is like really healthy behavior.
Like, what do you mean? Boundaries?
Like boundaries, explicit communication, honesty, like saying, hey, I'm really into you, but I also think I would like to keep seeing this other person. Instead, you just don't tell them about the other person. Like, it's just, basic sort of communication, emotional safety type skill sets that we're not using because we're afraid that we're going to lose the other person.
Or be rejected.
Yeah, we're going to be rejected.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what you were saying in the beginning, at what point does someone go, I don't know, their sweater was kind of meant like, I didn't like this about them. I'm not sure about that. At what point does somebody continue seeing that person or leave? Like where do you draw that line between like being open and then also realizing like, no, this person is just not for me?
I just hate all their sweaters. I am kind of the mindset that some people don't make good first impressions. And someone can be really nervous because they think you're so beautiful or because they think you're so smart or because. And so I always say, like, give people a second chance unless you don't feel safe or something was super off-putting or you're like, wow, this goes against like who I envision myself to be with. But I always think giving people a chance or two is a kind thing to do, mostly because this isn't a performance. They're not rehearsed. They're not going to say the right thing all the time. They're not going to wear the right thing all the time. And so it's just making that space for humanity. Now, if you encounter them and you're like, really, like, I know in my body this is not my person, fine. But if you're like, meh, then it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, that's the reality. Sometimes you're like, meh, that was okay, I don't know. Give it a shot. And also, what do you have a clear idea of what you're looking for? What are your priorities? Do you care what they dress like, or are you going to help them figure out their sense of style? Is this a character flaw, or is this just like a preference thing? And so I think having a clear idea of what we want before entering into like the dating pool is really important. It makes it much easier for us to discern when we should give someone a try and when we shouldn't. But when we're like, I have no idea what I want, and then it's almost like you're in a dark room looking for an object that you've never seen before and don't know what it looks like. And so, like, what are the chances you'll find that thing that you've always wanted?
Yeah.
And like when they
It's
turn
so
on the
arbitrary.
light, it's so arbitrary. And so having an understanding of like what you want, I think is so important. And then that will help you see if you should give someone a chance or not.
I think that is one of the benefits of being single, like after a divorce or after the end of a long relationship or after a lot of, unpleasant dating experiences or both, mixed, good and bad. But I remember when I got divorced, last year, beginning of this year, a lot of people were like, well, aren't you scared? You're 38 or 39. I was 38. And I was like, no, because yeah, like I know who I am and I know what I like and what I don't like and what I want and what I don't want. And that relationship taught me a lot about what I'm not okay with and what I am okay with. And I felt like I came out of that with so much information about myself that I didn't have before. And, not to say like, oh, it was all, thanks, ex-husband.
Yeah. You prepped me.
But like, if we're looking for the silver lining and, the good, I think that that's a huge benefit that I wouldn't have necessarily had I not had that experience.
But I love that. What happened was you lived through something and you learned a lesson.
Yeah.
What happens a lot. Yeah, it is a novel idea. We don't all do it. Yeah. I think what happens a lot is we just don't learn anything. We don't take a moment to be like, why didn't this work? Why was that off-putting? Why do I tend to repeat cycles and patterns? And then we just think it's the other person's fault. And we keep looking for someone who will miraculously make this pattern go away. And I don't think that will ever happen. I think we are a big part of the patterns that we're living. And so if someone is willing to learn from their past relationship, they're so much more prepped for the next one. And I like it because you're like, I'm not scared. And I hope that that's how people feel once they've like processed a relationship and been like, here's my takeaway. You should feel more empowered. You should feel more prepped and more confident to move forward. So I think that was really beautiful. And yet I think a lot of us don't learn things the first try.
I want to ask about kind of the other end of the spectrum. So we were talking about like dating, not being sure. What about if you meet somebody and it's like very intense? I know that there's a lot of information out there. Like if it's intense, it's not good. It's an old pattern. It's like from your childhood. There's love bombing, all of that. What is your
we love the
take
love
on
bombing.
That?
Yeah. I think human dynamics are so unique and so complex. And I genuinely think you can meet some people and just have this very electric, explosive soul meeting other soul sort of moment that doesn't have to be negative. I think in situations like that, when the emotions are so high and there seems to be such fast intimacy, you have to be a little careful just to protect yourself, to make sure the pacing is appropriate for someone that you don't probably know very well, even though you feel like you really do. But I also think there's something really wonderful and beautiful. And it's not necessarily, okay, if they're love bombing you, sure, make sure they're not doing that, kids.
Yeah.
But if it's just sort of like you met the right person, I think this happens in friendships too. I don't know if it's happened to you, but there's a couple of people I meet and I'll be like, oh my God, you're my person.
Yeah.
And it's like immediate. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm in love with you. Like, and so why would it be any different in a romantic relationship? It's just that what you do with it is what matters. And so just being, mindful and making sure the pacing is appropriate and making sure you're still being safe emotionally. That's all it is. But I don't think it's like a bad thing. Like, God forbid you had an instant amazing connection. Like, how did we make that a negative?
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking. Like, I feel like we all have these things in our head now as a result of social media and just kind of the culture right now. Like, oh, that person's a narcissist and like that person's love bombing. And we just want to label everything. Yeah. And I think back to like when I started dating my now boyfriend, we had been kind of set up when I was separated. I was like not in that place to date because I was working on my marriage. And then we were set up again when I was divorced and I was still not really trying to date, but I was like, we'll see, like zero expectations. And I was like, wait, this guy's kind of amazing. And from the get-go, he was just so open about his feelings, his intentions, everything. And I was like, this is love bombing.
Or healthy.
Yeah. And I don't know. And I was like, why do I have that in my head? Like, why do I think we're so quick to jump to the worst conclusion. And, 9 months, he's still the same exact person. Like, that's just how he is. He knows what he wants and he didn't want to play any games and there's no pretense or anything.
No, what we've done is weaponize mental health a little bit. We are grossly misusing terms, watering them down, overusing them. And so that's the part that makes me sad. I'm so glad we're talking about mental health. But like calling someone a narcissist is so wildly inappropriate if they're not. And chances are they're not. Maybe, I sometimes they say they're not a narcissist. They just sound like an asshole. And I do think there's like a difference between the two. And so, yeah, we're also almost like a society avoidant a little bit. We're like, something must be wrong if someone's so intense and so committed right away. And I don't know if that's like a millennial Gen Z thing now, but it's like, well, if you believe that you are a wonderful human being, why wouldn't someone be that excited and that vocal and that honest about how they're feeling? And so, yeah, I love that you share that because a lot of people feel uncomfortable when someone's all in at the start. And to me, it's like, isn't that what we kind of want? And I like did a reel about this where people get the ick because someone is too available.
Yeah.
Blew my mind. I was like, where are we? What is happening?
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, I get it. If the only reason you would feel that is if you're not into them and you're like, oh my God, you're giving me so much attention and I just do not reciprocate. I'm not into it. But I've never met someone who was so into another person and then their attention was like off-putting. You'd be like, oh my God, they feel the same way. This is so cute. We're really into it. It's reciprocated. And so the ick because someone's too available just shows me that we are sometimes not as available as we think we are. And that's maybe more of an issue than someone just being too honest and too into it.
There are a couple of things, couple concepts that I want to ask you about while we close it out here. One is, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was phrased. I think I saw it this morning or yesterday, but basically it was about like dating. And it was like, if there's any confusion about how they feel, like that's your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
Oh dear. Oh my. Thanks for putting me in the hot spot. No, I don't think so.
I love your responses.
Look, it means that they clearly don't want to commit to you right now. Like if you've, okay, wait, clarifying question.
Yeah.
Have you asked them and they said, I don't know, or their behavior is screaming, they don't know?
I don't know. I just saw it on social media.
Great, thanks.
And they were basically just saying like, you know, it was one of those like empowerment kind of accounts. And it's like, if you're confused, like that's your answer. And I'm like, I kind of get like back to my thing. I was like, oh, I was never confused. I knew exactly where he stood. But I think there's nuance. I don't think every situation is like that.
I would say there's nuance. I think for the most part, I'd say, yeah, I like that because then people are not wasting their time. But what if you have different communication styles? What if they need more time to process their feelings before expressing them? What if they're not a texter? What if they're not? So I say yes, but use it with caution and give people the benefit of the doubt. Like ask, if you're confused, ask and be like, I'm not, your behavior is kind of indicating to me that you're not into this, or I'm very confused, which makes me feel like you're not into this. Let's talk about it. But I think just walking away from relationships because one day you didn't feel super appreciated by this person is a little extreme. So I think clarifying is great. But if you are constantly confused, then I think it does track.
I love what you said though about like asking.
Yeah.
Communicate. Be assertive. I remember when I got sober, I had so many resentments and I was doing this exercise where I had to like look at all the resentments and look for my part. You're probably familiar with it. And so much of my part was like, I didn't assert myself. And so I would find myself in these situations where I felt like people were doing things to me or like treating me certain ways. But I didn't communicate. Like that's my part. And it's so important to remember that like you have a voice. And maybe it goes back to what you were saying before, like we're scared to communicate and scared to assert ourselves because we're so afraid of being rejected.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the number one reason we're not asserting ourselves, or lack of self-awareness where we don't actually know what we want to communicate with the person. But I would rather be rejected for asking what I want than be loved by someone who doesn't know me. Or doesn't
Mic drop.
or doesn't give me what I need. And so I think when you think cost benefit analysis, which is something I get my clients to do all the time, it doesn't add up. So I always think, and not just that, but staying quiet is self-abandonment. It's self-betrayal. It makes you, it really warps your sense of identity. And so there's just no positive outcome. And that relationship won't survive without you asserting yourself. And we think we're protecting the relationship when in reality, we are sort of avoiding temporary discomfort for a more permanent problem. And I think that that's kind of an important thing to have in the back of our head whenever we're feeling like a little anxious to bring up.
Co-sign everything you just said there. And I think that self-abandonment piece is so important. And I feel like that's where that turmoil is created, where suddenly you have this inner world where like you're not communicating your needs, your thoughts, whatever it is. And then your outer world is something completely different. And there's this like tug of war. And that's when we end up how you and I ended up.
That's how we ended up. And I think if you're someone who finds themselves just daydreaming a lot or fantasizing a lot and having a very different type of life in your head than what you're experiencing, often that's, sometimes called maladaptive coping, of having a very different reality of like, I would have said this and I would have asked for that. And next time and so it's just saying that, hey, maybe you're not expressing yourself in the most authentic way and you're finding sort of an alternate reality in which you can do that. And let's bring it into the present moment.
Amazing. Well, tell everybody where they can find you. I'm sure everyone's following you already, but
So yeah, I'm most active on Instagram at millennial.therapist. I also do have a book that's out. It's called It's On Me, and you can buy it anywhere books are sold. And I do write longer essays on Substack. It's called Notes from My Phone because I always write my notes on my phone. It's pretty
Amazing.
self-explanatory.
On the notes.
On the notes. So if you're into existentialism, that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.